question I get asked a bit is, what is a good lens for astrophotography? Now, the kind of astrophotography I'm talking about is a standard camera on a standard tripod. We're not tracking, we're not stacking, we're just single exposures, the simplest level of astro that we can do. Good lenses for astrophotography require a few criteria, three mainly. The first one is we want a lens that's ideally able to go to f2.8, so a nice big aperture. Reason for this is we want to be able to gather as much light as possible. Let's face it, we're shooting up into the sky, trying to capture light that's hundreds or thousands or even millions of light years away. So a nice big aperture is one of those key components. The second criteria for what makes a good lens for astrophotography is focal length, something in the region of 14 to 30 mil, round about there, preferably something on the wider side, especially a crop sensor camera like an APS-C sensor. So getting a lens that not only allows us to get a nice wide vista, so maybe the Milky Way is right up in the sky, but we want to get the landscape in there as well. But this focal length will determine how long we can expose for before we start getting obviously trailing stars. So the third criteria for what makes a good astrophotography lens is sharpness. Getting something that's nice and sharp and not this sort of blob or elongated. Different lenses will perform better or worse. So when it comes to those three criteria, I've got 4 lenses here that I've used extensively over the years, and they range from really affordable to, yeah, not so affordable. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Even though I'm a Canon shooter, these 2 lenses you can get for other brands, your Sonys, Nikons, etc. You just need to buy the right mount for it. These last 2, they are Canon specific lenses, very unlikely if you're not in Canon that you can use them, but don't click away when I get to them because there'll be some information and detail about their focal lengths and their specifications, which might help you when you're thinking about your next lens specifically for astrophotography. So for the first lens, this is my Samyang 14mm f2.8, and the Samyang is also available under the brand Rokinon. Don't worry, they are exactly the same lens, so you may not have Samyang where you are, but you've got Rokinon, vice versa. Exactly the same lens, just the name is different. Now we've already hit 2 of the 3 criteria. It's a 14mm lens, so it's nice and wide, and it's f2.8. So the biggest pro for this lens is the cost. It's a great gateway astro lens. It's a lens that you can buy for just 300 kangaroo skins or whatever the currency you have in your part of the world, but it's a cheap lens. Being a prime lens, it's reasonably sharp, so our third criteria, it is more than acceptable. The Samyang is a full manual lens. By that, we have manual aperture control and we also have manual focus with no autofocus. There is a version of this lens that does have autofocus, but it's at least twice the cost and starts getting out of that really affordable entry point if you're still a bit undecided. The other pro for this lens, it's light. So check it out. We're only 550 grams or almost 20 ounces, 19.5 ounces. So it's light, and that's a really handy thing. Now, as to the cons for this lens, so when we are talking about the manual aperture, the fact that it's manual is not a big deal, but it won't talk back to the camera. So when you're looking at the back of your camera and all of your settings, you won't see an F number like 2.8, etc. It'll just be double zeros. Just what this means is you have to be super conscious that you do set it to that f2.8. The other small con, it's only a manual focus. Now, that's not too bad because when we're shooting astrophotography, often we have to rely on manual focus. But as you're going to see in some other lenses, autofocus can have a bit of a benefit. But the thing being a 14mm wide lens is that the stars are like really, really small. So getting that focus can sometimes be a bit of a challenge and might take a little bit of practice. I know with my lens in particular, even though infinity does start here, and often advice about focusing for astro, you'll hear, oh, just go to infinity and you'll be fine. On this lens, if I do that, it is super, super soft. But I do know that if I go to the hard stop, so I can't turn the lens for focus anymore, and then I just come back just a bit. That, through getting to know this lens, for me, I get nice sharp focus. But let's have our expectations well and truly tempered. Even though we've got the nice low price, the sharpness of it, it is quite good, and that is our third criteria, but it's never going to be a razor sharp lens like you're going to see some of the others coming up. However, it will easily outperform a lot of other lenses, which when it comes to trying to focus on stars, just aren't going to do a good job at all. The second-hand market for these, so you might be paying that $300-400 to buy new. Second-hand, you'll look at half price, and if you do get one second-hand and you do decide that, hey, this astrophotography, it's great, I'm loving it, and you go to sell it because you want to upgrade it, you'll probably get back what you had into it. So just a word of caution as well buying these lenses. Sometimes you do get a soft copy of it. So by soft, I mean that the stars are never going to be properly sharp, elongated corners, etc. These really cheap lenses, sometimes that's the price that we pay. So if you're buying new, just check the return policy of where you're getting from. In that event that you do get the Samyang or the Rokinon 14mm and you do end up with one of these soft copies, make sure you can take it back and exchange it. Second lens, this is my Tamron 15-30mm f2.8. Now, this is a great performing lens. So, all right, we've got our two criteria, that 15-30mm focal range and our f2.8, tick, tick. Sharpness, we're going to hit that criteria as well. This has been a great sharp lens for Astro for me. Into the corners is also quite decent. It's been a really good performer. What I like about the ability to be able to zoom in is, again, at that 15mm, the stars can be sometimes a little challenging to focus on. So what the benefit of having a small zoom is, we can find a bright star or even a planet if Mars or Venus is in the sky, point your camera up to that, zoom in to our 30mm, get focus either via manually or autofocus, and once you've done that, you can zoom back out and be fairly confident because this is a quality lens. In that changing of the zoom, we rarely run the risk of our focus also changing, which can be frustrating. But a benefit to this lens though is it does have autofocus, and depending on your camera, but certainly in my experience through a number of Canons, 6D, 5D Mark IV in particular, the R5, the autofocus actually does pretty good. So what I'll do is put the lens into autofocus, point it to a bright star in the sky, give the camera a little go at autofocus, see how it is, and then put the lens back into manual focus so that when I hit that shutter again for the real shot, the lens doesn't re-hunt. So for me, I've found the autofocus can perform reasonably well, but on those times when it doesn't, I've got the full manual up my sleeve. Cons to this lens? Well, there's a couple. One, it's a brick. In the world of wide-angle lenses, this one comes in at, look at that, over 1.1 kilos, or what's that, just over 40 ounces. So it's a heavy lens. If weight is important to you, this will be something for you to consider if you are looking at this lens. The other con about this lens, just to be conscious of, is that we do have this bulbous front glass and a fixed lens hood. The con to that means that if you do go to put filters on the front of this lens, especially for daytime photography, a polarizer, a neutral density filter, etc., unfortunately you can't buy into the 100mm system like from Lee or Nissi filters, for example, and you have to go into the 150mm. Gets quite expensive. It is something just to be conscious of, that's all. The focus ring, if I am trying to manual focus, there's a nice bit of resistance to it. So when you're twisting the focus and when you get it where you feel it's just right, in letting go, you can be pretty confident that that's not going to just nudge the ring, like what can happen with, say, kit lenses, where those focus rings are so loose, you breathe on the things and you'll knock them out of whack. Same with the actual zoom function. It's nice and stiff. You're not going to zoom into a particular point and then lose the focal length that you're actually trying to achieve. Now, what I really do like about this lens is that with the 15mm, I can shoot good and wide. So if I am after more of the Milky Way along with the landscape in the foreground, I'm going to get that. But if I want to go maybe for more detail into the core, shooting at 30mm, I need to reduce my shutter speed, but I can zoom into 30mm and get greater detail of whatever part of the night sky that I'm shooting into. And you'll see from these two examples that 15mm to 30mm, so these shots were done with the same lens on the same night, and one I was at 15 and the other I was 30. You'll notice in the data that my ISO, I had to double my ISO because my shutter speed reduced, but ignoring all of that, the difference in focal length you'll see is quite significant. Now there's a small issue with this lens. Tamron have discontinued it. Now don't click away, don't go forward yet. So even though they've discontinued this lens as well as the second generation, the G2 version of the lens, I don't know why they've discontinued it. It's a great lens for astrophotography, but the fact is the second-hand market of these is holding up quite well and you can save a bit of money. And you'll also see in the links down below, Tamron's Amazon store, they do have these lenses at half the price of what they used to sell for. So these would easily go $1,000, $1,500 brand new. But the ones on the Tamron site, I believe they're probably just refurbished lenses. That'll be fine. You'll have a warranty with Tamron. Do check terms and conditions. So yeah, it's a real shame that they're not making this one anymore. But if you're thinking you want something a bit above the Samyang, but you're not ready to really splurge big in an expensive lens, picking up the Tamron 15 to 30mm is going to be a great option. If you've been finding this useful and interesting so far, how about a quick like there for me? And if you're somebody that does have a favorite astrophotography lens, chuck it down in the comments. Let everybody else know what you've used and the results that you've had out of it. Lens number 3. This is my Canon 24 to 70mm f2.8 Mark II lens. Yes, we are into the Canon specific lenses now, but don't back out of the video because some of the information coming up could be quite useful for you. So, criteria. f2.8, tick. Focal length, now being it starts at the 24 to 70mm, yes, at a starting point of 24mm, we are at a sort of more tighter zoomed in starting point than our magic 15 to 30, but this lens has been one of my favorite Astro lenses because at 24mm, I actually like the aesthetic of how the sky looks. So there's just something about zooming in a little bit more, getting some lens compression into the landscape. And this lens at 24mm is a field of view, which is a real favorite of mine. We've got our aperture, we've got our field of view, sharpness. This lens has sharpness in spades, and it would want to, okay? So when we take the lens hood off, it does have the little red ring on there, and if you're in Canon, you kind of know what that means. You chuck a 0 onto the price, but ignoring that, as an Astro lens, it is so good. I've taken some great photos of the night sky with this lens, including this one, which is a portrait orientation panorama of the Milky Way down in Tasmania, and you can see there's an aurora in the corner. This is one of my earliest and still my most favorite astrophotography images that I've ever taken, and it was done with this 11-year-old lens. So it is an older lens, let's face it, but thankfully it does also connect to my R series of Canon cameras through an adapter, so I've been able to take it forward with me. So we do have that ability to zoom in a little bit if we like, and the zoom ring is nice and stiff. The focus ring as well, when we're trying to get manual focus, there's good stiff feedback through the focus ring, so we're not going to nudge it as we let go, so that's really good. And I've gotten great sharp images with this lens. The cons to it, well, in my opinion, there's really only one, and that's the price. So we are talking in local money over $2,500, but this is one of Canon's flagship lenses. Now, would I buy it specifically for Astro? No, there are other lenses that will be better value for money and will perform quite decently in their own right. This, however, is a lens that I got at the start of my photography journey, and then as I fell into astrophotography, it just turned out that this baby at 24mm f2.8 is just a stellar standout lens. If we have a look at the weight, it's not too bad. We're at 800 grams or what have we got there? 28.9, 29 ounces. So it's not as heavy as the Tamron, but certainly a little heavier than the Samyang. But at 800 grams, that's not bad. I would not think of this as a particularly heavy lens. All right, we're almost done. One last lens to go. Okay, lens number 4. This is my Canon 16 to 35mm f2.8 Mark III. This has been a great lens for astrophotography. Now, like the 24 to 70 Canon, it's not a cheap lens. We're talking over 3,000 for this. Would I buy it just for astro? No, maybe unless I won the lotto last night. I didn't. Criteria 1, f2.8, brilliant. Our field of view, it's a 16 to 35mm lens, so yes, we've got that nice wide view with the added bonus of being able to zoom in a bit, either for focus or to try and get in for a bit more detail. So we've hit those two criteria. Sharpness, this is a cracker, but only the Mark III. So if you are a Canon shooter and you're looking online and you come across the Mark II version of this lens and the original, I would avoid it, not only for astro, but just photography in general. The Mark II of the 16 to 35 is known as a soft lens, particularly out in those corners. So not something that I would recommend. We've got a standard glass on the front, so we don't have the bulbous glass of the Tamron or the Samyang for that matter. We do have the ability for manual focus as well as autofocus. Autofocus with this lens, similar to the others, yeah, depending on your camera combo, I've had good experience with that, but also manual focus being there as an option. Our focus ring, just like the other next tier lenses, good firm feedback, so we're not going to bump it when we let it go. The zoom ring, also nice and stiff, so we're also not going to have issues there when we let it go. What I've really enjoyed about this lens in particular, where my 24 to 70mm, I showed that image of the panorama in Tasmania, that's actually 19 shots to get that. So we're talking about 10 minutes of shooting where we compose, shoot, recompose, shoot, times 19, make it into a panorama. At this focal length of around that 16mm, we can do the same in about 9, so half the time, half the images. So this panorama, for example, I shot with this lens over the Flinders Ranges in South Australia, and there was only about 7 or 8 images that made up the panorama because I was able to zoom out. When you're out and it's freezing cold in the pitch dark of night, time can matter. So for me, this has been a great performing and sharp lens, something I'm very happy to have when I'm thinking about my astrophotography. As to the weight, pretty similar to the 2470. Yeah, we've got 820 grams or 29.2 ounces, let's just call it 29 ounces. So not an overly heavy lens, definitely more than the Sigma, but not as much as the Tamron. If you've been watching this video because maybe you're a bit new to astrophotography, you might watch this one next, where I talk about the basics of astrophotography in under 11 minutes. So, of course, there are lots more lenses that are good for astrophotography out there, not just these four, but they've been the lenses that I've used and been really happy with them. Now get out there and shoot something amazing.